So, Aaron, let's get started then. Welcome, everyone again. I am Arjun S. Mehta, and I'm a director, community and learning here at Automation Anywhere. And I have our experts here along with me, Mr. Aaron, and he's a senior product trainer at Automation Anywhere. We also have Vineet Pujari. He's a senior product manager. He takes care of the API tasks. And we also have Nirmal, lead technical writer, and he focuses on the API tasks. So if you have read some documentation on the Docs portal, most probably it's written by Nirmal. And the product, part of the product, I mean, like Vineet manages the product, and Aaron creates a lot of content around all these topics. So thanks a lot for all the speakers to join me in this session. So let me quickly show you the agenda for today. We have a packed agenda. Aaron is going to show us a lot of interesting things.
And there we are.
Okay, great. So today we are all just going to talk about API tasks. Aaron will lead the show for us here. He's going to tell us what an API task is, what is the setup required for this, how do you configure this. He'll also talk about a couple of use cases, where is this useful, and this API task can be used within forms and processes. So he's going to show us how can you integrate these API tasks in the forms and processes. And while you're building this API tasks, how do you like debug this API tasks, and how can you run this API tasks independently as well? He's going to talk about all this, and after that, I'll be back to take a lot of questions. Like even during the session, feel free to ask, put in your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll have our product managers take those as well. And after the session also, we will have one more round of Q&A in case if something is not covered during the session. We will take that up. And then I'll also talk about the new courses which we have just released in Automation Anywhere University, and some of the upcoming courses which are going to be live in the next couple of weeks. We'll also talk about what's the upcoming developer meetup like this one in the month of May. Okay, that's all. That's all related to the agenda. I will hand it over to you, Aaron. Aaron, all yours now.
All right, great. Thank you, Arjun. I'm going to have to screenshot your agenda here, make sure I cover everything. There's a lot to cover
Sure.
in this short amount of space that we have today. But let's go ahead and get going on this. I'm going to share my screen, which you should see momentarily.
Yes, we can see your screen.
All right. And what I've got here is already a pre-built exercise, but I want to kind of walk you through each part of this, each individual component of this, to really help you understand both why we use an API task and what is it, and really what does it do? Because that's really what we're here for. We want to find out what this new technology is. So let's start at the beginning of what I've got here. And at a very simple level, I've just got a new customer data entry form. I'm going to be asking for a first name, I'm going to be asking for a last name, and then I'll be asking for a US postal code called a zip code. Now, zip code allows us to identify the areas where mail and packages would be sent. And so each part of the United States has its own distinct 5-digit zip code. Now, there are extensions to that where we have a 9-digit zip code to get even more precise, but this is going to just use that 5-digit lookup.
Aaron, just to interrupt you for a second, do you
Sure.
mind just sharing what is an API task? How is it different from the task bot? Just to set the context for somebody who may not have worked for API task.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we take a look, if I just create a very simple task bot here, and I'll just call this sample task bot, I've got a number of different actions here that will run on a bot runner or a bot agent, meaning that on your developer workstation, you can actually run these actions in real time. and you'll be able to see what's going on. And there's a huge range of different features, everything from, being able to automate browser applications. And with the recorder package, we can go and do things like automate Windows applications. There's all kinds of different things. And this all runs on the bot agent on the either developer workstation or the bot runner computer. Now, that's all fine and dandy. That's old news to most of us. Now, if I go and create a new API task, and I'll call this one sample API task. I know I'm really creative. You may notice one of the first things right out of the box is we're missing a number of actions here. There's no recorder. There's no browser. So what good is API tasks? Well, really what these API tasks are separate little agents that run in the cloud. They don't run on your local workstation unless you're in debug mode, and we'll see that in a little bit. And they don't run on a bot runner. So this offloads that need for running those types of automations, these simpler types of automations, to the cloud. So we don't have to worry about running them on our bot agent. Is that clear enough for that?
Yes, Aaron,
Oh, okay.
that's great. Thank you.
All right. I just want to make sure that I get that all taken care of here so we can start off with this. Now, the neat part about API tasks is, again, since they don't run on the local workstation or anything, these can actually be run on non-Windows computers because our bot agent does require a Windows computer to do this. So for simple tasks like what API tasks can do, you could run this automation on a Mac because, again, it's not actually running on the Macintosh computer. It's running, excuse my cat, it's running on the cloud on an instance that's actually spun up and spun down in real time. All right, so let's take a look at this again a little bit closer. And I want to take a look at these individual parts. And I'm going to start off with, let's start off with the zip lookup API task for the form. Now, this API task actually calls an API. Yes, we're kind of a little insurrection action going on there. But we start off with just calling a REST web service, and we pass over a zip code to a zip lookup. This is just a service that we have on one of our demo servers. That returns a JSON message, which is then processed. We extract city, state, the short version of the state, the county, latitude and longitude, and then we also create a custom Google Maps link for this. So all of this is done inside the API task. This is going to run in the cloud. And one of the things you may notice right off the top is there's no run button up here. And that's because API tasks are designed to run in the cloud. Now we can run them in debug mode. If I go into debug and let's say I want to bring in all of my variables and I run this, I can actually see this running in real time and I can debug it. So you're not going to be flying blind when it comes to API tasks, but they don't run the same way as a regular taskbot was. So just kind of keep that in mind as you go through this. So this is kind of the back end of what I'm going to be using for my data entry form. Let's close this for just a moment and I'll show you the form where this integrates into. Now this form, just a very, very basic form. We've got a first name, we've got a last name, and we've got the field for our zip code, or again, postal code in most other countries. I've also got a button here that just says zip lookup. Now, why do I even have this in here? Well, I want to have the city, the state, and the county already populated for me, so I don't have to type all this in. Google Maps link, okay, that's kind of cool, but not really necessary. But let's take a look and see how the form and the API task kind of work together to make this actually work, make this button work. And I do this inside the form in the form rules. And if I go into the form rules, I can add additional rules to this, like if I had additional buttons or anything on here. But all I had to do was just add a new rule, and I add that based on that zip lookup button. And you can see we've got actions for a whole bunch of different form things that we have available here. But in my case, I only wanted to see, is the button clicked? And when that button is clicked, that event is triggered and it does these elements. In my case, I switched this over to a form action and we have a get a value from an API task. Now, the API task and a task bot, if you've used parent and child bots where you're passing variables from one to the other using input and output type of variables, exactly the same thing with API tasks. So it's nothing new to learn if you've already done that. And probably most of us have. All I have to do is tell it which API tasks that I'm working with. And in this case, it is that zip lookup API task for forms that I've got. Now, this API task has got one input, and that's that zip code. Then we have all of those other values returned. We had city, state, county, Google Maps. Now, you may have noticed that I don't have all of those outputs set up to a variable. I don't really need them all. I'm only going to be working with these 4 fields. So all I had to do was just grab these. But I did include them all in that API task, so I could reuse this same API task in a different form. So I could do a zip lookup if I did need the shorter version of the state, which is usually 2 characters instead of the full length of the state name. So for instance, California would be CA, Wisconsin would be WI, etc. So all of this is in that form rules section of this form. Now that's all fine and dandy, but it looks like, this is not really tied to anything. And well, it is tied to text boxes as it gets returned back and when it comes in. But we also have other connections, which you'll see shortly in the process itself. Any questions on this initial part of getting the API task to work within a form? Anything on this so far in the chat?
Hey, Aaron, I think there's a question about how did you add the animation for the bank logo?
This is just an animated GIF. That was a great question. Or GIF, which one do we call this? We started another controversy, kind of like the flow view versus list view thing.
Yeah, GIF is good. Yeah.
But yeah, animated GIFs actually do work here in Forms. So nothing cool, nothing, bizarre on that.
So you just drag and drop an image element and then you browse and select your GIF.
Yeah, there's an image thing here. And if I was to put in a new image, for example, I'd have to go in here and then select the file or upload a new one.
Great, thank you.
Great question.
There's one more question from Christian. API tasks are useful only for API endpoints that are public. How about like not private on our local infrastructure?
Oh, that would be fine too. And if we take a look at the zip lookup here, I'm just calling a REST web service to this RPA demo site. But if I was running this internally, all I'd have to do is just replace the URI there with the IP address of the local server, for example. So that would work internally too.
Okay. And there's one more question. Just like the current API you're calling within this form, are you using REST method most of the time or OAuth, OAuth2 are also applicable?
I don't believe that's applicable in this case for the API tasks. Yeah. And Vineet, if you have any background on that, that would be good as well.
Yeah, sure. So the question was about how will it work if our internal API services expect certificate-based authentication? Yeah. So at the moment, we support OAuth2 via the client credentials mode, right? We also working on, having a certificate-based OAuth2 pretty soon, and you can configure your OAuth2 connection in the control room, and it will be managed, meaning once you just have to configure it once, and then the control room will take care of refreshing the access token whenever it expires using certificate-based authentication. So that's coming up very soon in 34.
Okay. And then one more question is, for which version is API task package available from?
Tasks are available starting A.31 release, which went live in January earlier this year. So yes, that's the version.
Okay.
Mhm.
And there's one more question. How do we get detailed reading about this? Any use case explaining end to end to learn more about the API task? We do have a course for this on Automation Anywhere University. So you may want to just look up by API task and you should be able to get some video there.
And we have a lot of information in our doc site as well. If I just,
Yeah, also in
Yes.
the docs, actually, we have a end-to-end example.
yeah.
Yes.
And what we were just looking at here was the API task in form, and we're going to see the API task in process here just in a few moments.
Okay.
Great questions. I love it.
We'll just take one more question and then probably Aaron, you may want to continue.
Okay.
If the API tasks run on your cloud, not using the bot agent, how does the A360 cloud connect to the local IPs because they are private and not available from internet?
Yeah, and that is correct. The REST web service will work if you are on a task bot with a local IP address, whereas if it is running on an API task, then unless you had some other way of getting to it, it would not be able to get to private internal IP addresses. You're correct.
Yeah, and I'd like
Oh,
to add a little bit to that answer.
Please do.
So thanks, Aaron. So so API tasks are hosted and are executed on Automation 360 Cloud. And in case you are invoking any internal web services, those web services that are not exposed outside of your firewall, then you would need to open up, or you would need to whitelist the API task traffic from Automation 360 Cloud inside of your firewall. Only then API task can actually perform the automation that you've defined uh, inside of it using your internal web services.
Exactly.
Yeah, and we are going to document the NATed IP addresses on the documentation portal as well. So depending on what region your cloud resides, you could take those IP addresses and whitelist only those in your firewall.
okay. Thanks for adding that, Vineet. Aaron, you can continue, and while we take some of the questions in the chat.
Okay. And I want to continue by looking at another way of using an API task, because we had this one that's integrated with the forms, and I've named it as such. So that's kind of an important distinction here. I also have the ability to have another API task that can be called within a process. Now, for those of you who have not really gotten into the whole process thing, we'll take a look at that in a little bit more detail. But in this case, I have this API task just writing that information out to a database. In this case, I'm calling this web service on our demo server again. And we're sending all these values. We've got the first name, the last name, city, state, county, Google Maps link, and the zip code that we searched with. So all of that's going to be sent over to this REST web service for recording into a database. Now, at this point, it could also have some other public form of database, something else, a different API, pretty much anything out there that we can get to from the public internet. Even, putting it into a Microsoft Excel document. I could have done that as well. But in this case, I'm just sending that over to this REST web service for recording. And on the way back, I take a look and make sure that that actually did record correctly. And I've got a variable that I'm calling sResponse. That just tells me, okay, was I able to add this correctly? And we've got a string that kind of explains that, customer added. And upon fail, I've got that sResponse being set to add failed. Now, this is important because I need some way to communicate to the process that something didn't work correctly. So let's delve into the process itself and see how that's structured. Again, if you have not used processes, this is something that you really want to get into and understand and learn, because really the next format of development of these processes is just going to be based on these processes. That was kind of redundant, wasn't it? But it's an important part to the development of these new applications. So if I start up at the start object here, this is not just a placeholder like it is in a taskbot. This is actually a functional point. And in my case, I actually pointed over to that customer data form that we saw earlier with the little spinning logo that you guys like. And then I just arbitrarily assign a request title to it, and this will launch that form automatically when I get this process started. So it almost, if you run this process just by itself with just that start, it looks like it's incomplete, but it will actually go and display that form with that button for the API task being active. So all of that is taken care of in this process. The next step that I've added in here is the process level API task. This is that one I just talked about where we're adding that to the database. Again, I've arbitrarily assigned these names, add to database, and it's kind of nice that it shows it here. So use words that actually make sense to you to describe these. We select that API task here, and we give it the input values. This should look extremely familiar to you based on using parent and child taskbot type things, because it's really the same type of thing. This is like the taskbot run, and you see all your input values. It's really the same type of thing. What you don't see here is the outputs. And that's kind of an interesting part of processes, and it took me a little bit to kind of get used to as well. But if we take a look at this next if, where I'm actually checking to see if it successfully added to the database, my if action here, the source value is coming from that add to database. And let me show you how that works. I'm going to go ahead and just put that variable back in here so you can see how this works. So my source value, if I hit this insert a value widget, we have to check and see which one of these do we want. Now, if I'm getting a value directly from that form, I'm actually going to choose request. And I can see all the form elements here. So if I wanted to get any of these values after they've been populated, I can do that directly from the form. In my case, I actually want to get the output from this add to database to see if it was able to add that successfully to the database or not. So in that case, I can see add to database dot sResponse. sResponse, again, being my output variable. And add like that. So it's best not to try to type in these variables. Yes, you can get away with that a little bit in the taskbot, but use the browse function in here just so that you don't accidentally have a typographical error. And this is very similar to regular if. We're doing string condition. I'm doing an includes because I want to see if it is customer added. I could have done an equals to as well. I just like to use includes in case I somehow, some way wanted to change this. So customer added to database. If I'm searching for just customer added, then I don't have to change my process in anything. And if it was successful, I go to the completed, and I can display a message if I want to, or I can override some output variables. On the failure side, I can also do the same thing. I could put in a message in here such as unable to save the customer in the database. There we go. So we can make changes like that. And the processes are really easy to link together. It makes a little bit more sense than trying to do the parent and child bot things where you're kind of blindly going, oh yeah, I need to call this child and then get the response back. This is a visual way of doing it. Again, kind of referring to the t-shirt, we're looking at flow view here. And it really works out, but it takes a little bit of practice because it is different than using a regular task bot. All right, so what we've got here so far is our form-based API tasks and our process-based API tasks. But there is some setup that has to be done on the form-based API tasks. And to see that, I'm going to switch over to an admin login on the same control room. And this is something that your administrator will have to do. And it also precludes you from doing this type of functionality in the community edition.
Aaron, sorry to interrupt.
Yes,
I just
please.
want to double check if the audience are able to listen to Aaron, because there are some folks who are saying their audio is disabled. Can you please confirm if you are all able to hear Aaron clearly?
Okay, getting some positive results in the chat.
Okay, it looks like the audio is okay. For whoever the audio is a challenge, you may want to just log off from Zoom and log back in. You know, most probably it should fix the issue, because we see that a lot of people are actually able to hear clearly. Thank you for the confirmation, and sorry for the interruption, Aaron.
No worries at all. And Latha G, that is expected. Microphone option is disabled because we have several hundred people on here, and getting us all to talk at the same time would just be a little challenging.
Okay, please go
Thank you
ahead.
for your
Thank you.
question, though. That was great. Okay, so back to our regularly scheduled program here. I'm in my admin account, and I need to go to the administration and then settings. And then down at the bottom, I've got this cloud device management option. And this is where I have to actually add that API task to be allocated for those containers that get spun up and spun down in real time. If I don't have this, when I go to my form and try to integrate that API task, I'm going to get a message that I couldn't find that API task, which isn't the most obvious error message, but what it means here is that we didn't allocate that API task for you, and you need to get the admin to do this. Now, the admin, it's not terribly difficult. They just go in, they go to, let's see, in here, and select that API task. Now, that API task does have to be checked into public. So that's another important part of this process. Once that's checked into public, the admin can choose that API task and add that to the API task allocations. And at that point, that will allow it to run in real time in those containers on the cloud. All right, so let's continue with this and let's see what this actually does. Let's see how this works in real time. And I'm going to launch this using the process. And you can see we got our new customer form pop up just as before. We'll put Arjun in here. And let's see if I can botch spelling his last name. And we'll put him in the famous zip code 90210 from the television show in the 1990s. And when I hit this zip lookup, this is not running on my bot runner. Nothing popped up on my screen at all. You saw there was no bot runner pop up at all. Instead, it went and it populated these fields for me and even gave me my little Google Maps link if I really need it. At that point, so I've got my form one, and I can even do another lookup here too. What zip code should we look up? We'll do the first one that pops up. Okay, we're going to do 00960. That's from the East Coast somewhere. Let's find out where that is. And it did not like that. So I'm going to try this 46804. And that one is Fort Wayne, Indiana in Allen County. I hope that is correct. Yeah, these would have to be US postal codes. I'm sorry. I'm seeing some 6-digit postal codes. But you can see I can do multiple lookups, and it's just calling that same form-based API task over and over again. So no worries on that. It's really, really easy. After I'm done, I'm happy with what I've got here. I can just hit that submit, and it's going to go to the next step in the process, which is calling my API task that is a process-based API task. Again, no bot runner pop-up is showing up here, and my request is done. I can take a look at the results page here and just refresh it real quick. And there we go. And Arjun, you're now living in Fort Wayne, Indiana. It's a nice place. I've been there. I think I've still got some family in that general area too. And we can see a Google Maps link, which we can just click, and it'll take us right over to Fort Wayne, Indiana. So any questions on how all these pieces would kind of work together and how we get data from one part of the process to the next, or anything that you have at this point?
Yes, like the questions around like how do you publish this customer forms, and where is the form running versus where is the API task running?
That's a great question. Let's start off with where's the form running. The form is actually running on the web browser, and this can be launched directly from Copilot. And again, since this is all using API tasks, there's really no task bots in here, and we're going to ignore sample task bot because that's kind of what we just use as a demonstration. Excuse me. In fact, let's get those out of here so we don't even look at it. So any platform that could use a web browser, even a Chromebook, as diminutive as those computers are, as long as they've got a web browser, they could call this form. It would pop up on their screen, and they could interact with it and use those buttons for the API tasks. And it works exactly like what I just done here. No pop-ups on the bot agent showed up at all on this screen. That's because everything was running in those cloud containers. That's a great question. What else do we have there?
There's one more question. Is the API task async, meaning you could press zip lookup, then submit before the zip lookup could respond? How does that work?
That's a great question, and let's try it out. Let's see if we can break something. That's always fun. And we'll do this one, and I'm going to hit zip lookup and submit. Okay, so it did, in this case, go ahead and skip that zip lookup. Let's see how fast that worked. Now, that's actually a challenging thing to do because the API tasks run very quickly. And we can see here that it actually failed because it didn't have all the fields. So the web service that we used to save that to the database returned a failure message because we were missing some fields. So yes, I guess this would mean that it is running asynchronously. And so you do have to take that into account. Great question. And I not even tested that. That's great.
Yeah, great question. Just would like to add to what you said, Aaron.
Please.
So the API task that's invoked when Aaron clicked on the execute button, it does not block the user session. We do not block any resources on the UI or in the backend, which is why Aaron was able to click on submit and proceed to the next step. It failed. It doesn't matter because we did not wait for the zip code and the city to come back, which were sort of mandatory inputs for adding them to the database.
Yeah, and I could have possibly gotten around that if I had modified my form. I don't know if I've got these as marked as Required. Yeah. If I did this and mark these as required, then that would probably save us. I did have these fields marked as required, but just looked a little strange when I had that because then we've got red fields around each one of those text entries, even through this. So it kind of diverts the eye from this zip lookup. But yes, that would definitely save me because then I try to hit submit and it's giving me warnings all over the place. Excellent question.
And Aaron, since we were like going back, uh, going back and forth with so many process and forms, some people I think they got lost. So they're just trying to recap. Like,
Mhm.
what is this process all about? Do you want to just share that in a very high level and then again go back?
Yeah, absolutely. And processes are new. I get that. And it will take a little bit of time to get used to it. It took me a little while to get used to this as well. Um, what we do here with this process is we're starting off and having it display that form. Now that gives us everything that we had with the zip lookup part of this along with us. And you'll notice there's no tie-in anywhere in the process to that API task for the form. The only reference to that API task in the form is actually in the form rules itself. So without this form rule, if I were to delete this form rule from here, this button would no longer function and I wouldn't be able to look up my zip code. After I do everything I need to do in this form, is what will, when I hit that submit button, that's what takes me over to the next step, which is this API task, which is process based. This is not tied into a form. This is just something I can run directly from the process itself. Now notice I can also run task bots right from here too. So if I wanted to run something on a local task, I could. And that's going to run on the local bot agent on your bot runner or bot developer workstation. And there's no problem with that at all. Complete okay. This just gives that nice visual representation of the flow of the entire process so that when you do link task bots and API tasks and, excuse me, if we're working with document automation, we've got the steps for document validation, for example, in here. Wow, I've got the burps all of a sudden. Excuse me. But in our case, we're just using that process-based API task. We send it some input variables. These are all from the text boxes from that form. So for instance, if I go in here and I was trying to relink that, I would again use this process request as my variable source, and I could choose which field from that form I want to use as my input value. Now, this is actually kind of cool because I want to show you something. If I had a bot here, well, actually, I would have to build the bot. If I had a bot here in my process, I can actually get inputs from both the form itself and API tasks and any other elements all at the same time. So I'm not limited like you are with a regular task bot in the parent and child situation where you're only getting those values from the parent bot. In a process, you can gather them from multiple different places. And so it gives a lot more flexibility and a lot more ease of use once you get used to using these processes. But there is some learning that has to go on with this. And we've got some great videos on our Pathfinder Academy and docs on our doc site on how to work with these. Was that clear enough, or do we need something a little bit more?
I think this should be okay. Thanks,
Okay.
Aaron. You can proceed.
Okay. Yeah, and then the last step that we have in here is just checking to see were we successful or were we not. Now, if I wanted to, I could do additional steps at this point. I'm just keeping this as simple as possible for our demonstration purposes. I check to see if that string value contains customer added. If it does, we get the completed flag. Otherwise, and we saw this when we hit the submit button a little bit too quickly, we got the failed message, and we get that message that comes back up in the web form itself. But if you get used to using this and really working with these processes instead of kind of a parent and child bot thing, I think you're going to see that this will make your bot development processes a lot easier to follow and a lot easier to work with. And being able to grab values from multiple places as inputs is just a game changer with processes. You don't have to sit there and pass all these values from parent to child to child to child. Instead, grab them where you need them using that process. So it's a lot easier once you get used to that. Right. Anything else that we need to take a look at that?
How can a user launch this form without access to Automation 360? Is that possible?
Yes, that's all done through the Copilot. I think I've got, let me see if I can get that launched over here. Yeah, it sees that I'm logged in. I don't have any automations. But if someone had a Copilot login without a bot developer license, they'd be able to see automations on the page and they can just click on them. Just little different buttons that are on the page. So they'll be able to launch that. And this is just using a standard web browser. It doesn't require anything to be installed on the local computer, especially if you're using API tasks for the functionality. That could be literally any platform that has a web browser, Linux, Chromebooks, Macs, whatever.
Yeah, I just would like to add. So in addition to rendering these forms on any kind of web browser, the users would need a Copilot license to actually see the form, do some interaction on the form, right? So a Copilot license is a prerequisite in order to view the form and interact with it.
Yeah, I do see a question in the chat saying, is it possible to schedule an API task? The answer is you can't schedule the API task directly, but you will be able to, I believe you can schedule a process. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Today you can schedule a bot. You will be able to schedule an API task starting the release 8.33, which
Okay.
is coming soon. And you will be able to schedule processes starting release 8.34.
Okay, so great. Thank
Yeah.
you for that. And Luciano, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
So one more
And
question. Do you have any out-of-the-box APIs? I'm thinking about common connectors like Salesforce.
yeah, we do offer a lot of out-of-the-box connectors, Salesforce included, ServiceNow, all of the Office 365 apps, Google Suite apps. We also have connectors for SAP, BAPI, Apigee, and the likes. I'd like to also mention about the connector builder, which launched in release 32. So connector builder gives you the ability to create custom connectors for any application which is not supported out of box. And maybe that's a topic for another day, another developer meetup, but you can create connectors yourself in minutes.
Yeah, it's an
And
amazing technology. Anything that's got a published API, point it right over, and it's amazing. It just kind of makes its own package. It really is a game changer.
Okay, thank
Now,
you.
Don Nielsen is asking in chat here, Micah Smith demonstrated a product called Pixie Bricks, where users could add buttons to the browser, and that button would act as a launcher. I don't understand how it's all wired, but the demo was cool. And yes, that will work with these Copilot things. So if I wanted to embed this form in next to a Salesforce window, I could actually do that with the combination of Pixie Bricks, which is essentially just kind of a way of displaying an iframe in a web page, so where we can put anything in that iframe that we want. And that includes these objects from the forms. So we can have those types of form elements embedded in those applications.
Yeah.
Great question.
And Aaron, there's another question in the Q&A section by Devashish Panda. So the question is, you mentioned API task to database. Is the API task running in cloud, but interacting with the database using the database command? Or how is it adding data to the portal you showed?
Well, in my case, I'm actually using an API call. But if you had a database that is accessible to the greater internet, and that can be, what's that one cloud-based database? There's a number of them out there. You could actually connect to those cloud-based databases from your API task, do your SQL functions, and disconnect. In my case, I don't have access to a cloud-based database. So instead, what I did was I just made a custom web service on the demo site that received those values and save them to the database itself. Great question.
All right. Thank you. I think Nico has a good observation. Amazing how iframes have become relevant again.
Yes.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah, I'm waiting for frame sets too.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why iframes have become relevant is because people don't want to go to an automation platform, whereas they expect the automation platform to come to them, right? In their usual business process. Like if they spend most of their time in Salesforce, then there's no reason why they should toggle to 3 or 4 different applications, do automation individually in those apps and consolidate them and see the result in Salesforce. Using iframes, we can open up a section in the web page through which they can automate launch processes, do task automations or human approvals, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, iframes are very good for that because you can just put in whatever content you want in that iframe, even if it's from a different site. And that's kind of what Pixie Bricks leverages to embed these different applications within like Salesforce or ServiceNow or wherever you need to have that. So it's not new technology. It's just reuse and a new interesting way of using an older HTML functionality.
Yep. And there's a question from Vamshi in the chat. The question is, to run API tasks in form, we don't need an attended license. Can we run them as much as we want?
Yeah, and I don't have the information regarding licensing and use. Arjun or anyone
I can
else?
cover that in a bit here. I have a slide for that, so I'll cover this question there.
Okay. Would you like me to relinquish control?
Like, Aaron, do you have any other things to showcase before we kind of hand it over to Vineet?
No, I think we've covered pretty much everything. So I'm going to go ahead and stop my share then. And Vineet, you're welcome to take over.
Sure. Thank you, Aaron. That was a great demo.
Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron.
It was
Also,
fun making
Vineet, yeah, Vineet, there was questions around architecture in case if you have something to show for that as well.
Sure. I'll cover that in a slide as well. So just to recap what Aaron demonstrated just now, API tasks are a new way to automate processes, right? API tasks, essentially, they run on cloud, which means you don't have to worry about the maintenance of your on-prem infrastructure, right? Automation Anywhere hosts and manages this cloud. It takes care of all of the upgrades, the patches, making sure the bot agent is latest. So all of that administration task is actually done by Automation Anywhere for you, so that you can simply run your automations in the cloud and give a low latency experience to your users, right? And the data access is pretty fast, right? API tasks have two flavors. When you call them in a form, they basically just execute because we pre-deploy them on our containers, and they're just waiting for an execution request. The moment it gets a request, it simply executes and gives you back the response. And the other way is, Aaron showed that API task in a process, right, as a step in a process, which adds a record to a database. So you can also do async things using API tasks. It could be sending a message to somebody on Microsoft Teams or Slack or any such thing, right? You can even have API task process a bunch of records in an Office 365 Excel spreadsheet, right? So that is also possible. So next, I'd like to cover a little bit about the architecture of API tasks. So this is the control room on the left, and then below it you have the API AAS. That means API as a service infrastructure, and then on the right you have your infrastructure. Like you could have your workstations, your databases, and bot runner infrastructure that you have currently, right? Now, API tasks communicate with the control room to get the information about what are the actions defined in an API task, right? And then whenever you execute an API task, there's multiple ways to execute API tasks, right? Aaron showed two of the ways, one in form, one in process. You can also execute an API task as a standalone API endpoint, right? So if you look at the Swagger documentation starting A.31, you will see that there's a new endpoint added defined for API task, and you can call that endpoint and actually call it from any application you like, right? You could call it from your custom front end. You can even call it from your infrastructure, right? And you can deploy API tasks. So when you deploy an API task, what happens is the control room sends a message to the API task container, and along with the message, it tells which is the API task that needs to be deployed, what are its packages, what packages are being used inside of it, and everything, right? And these containers have a bot agent inside of them. It's the container has a image in which you get bot agent. There's pre-compiled libraries and all the dependencies that are needed for the API task to execute. So when you actually send a message to the control room, it actually deploys it to the container, and then the container responds with the result of the automation back to the user, right? If they're calling it from a form, it's displayed on a form. If they're calling it from the endpoint, it is sent back to the developer that called that endpoint, right? So that's how it works. I would also like to call that somebody mentioned Pixie bricks. We've also launched a new brick in the Pixie portal. So this brick allows you to invoke an API task as well. So you can directly invoke an API task from any portal. You can add a Pixie bricks button on any portal, and then you can have API task getting called in the background. You also have access to the latest Gen AI packages as part of our control room. And calling these packages is a great use case for API tasks. You know, if you're designing a chat interface and you're accepting natural language prompts from the user, and you want to decode those prompts, you want to call a Gen AI large language model, plus you also want to do some automation in the background. So API tasks are perfectly suited for such a use case, right? Because they offer very low latency. Most of the work is is done before you actually execute the API task. So we are seeing latency benchmarks in the units of milliseconds, 50 to 60 milliseconds. So that gives a great experience for a Gen AI use case, right? Where users expect response in 1 or 2 seconds and not like 10 or 20 seconds, right? If that makes sense.
And now Nirmal has actually like worked on a lot in terms of the documentation. So I would like to request Nirmal to show the documentation portal which has the API tasks. Thank you, Vineet.
Sure, Arjun. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen.
Sure.
Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. So let me go, show you the docs. So you have to go to the docs.automationanywhere.com, which is our portal, and you can search for API task here, and you can click on this link. So here you see we started with a basic introduction about what is an API task. And you see this is the main thing, like cloud only. As Aaron and Vineet covered, right now it's a cloud only feature. And after this brief introduction, we start, as Aaron showed, we show the thing how we invoke the API task in form. And if you remember, he showed like, where the admin comes into play and where the professional developer comes into play. So this is clearly mentioned here, and where the admin, he has to add the API task to the cloud is always an admin's task. Once that is done, in a Copilot or outside the control room, people can call this and run this. So in this topic, you'll see like we have clearly listed like each task here, what a person to follow in order to make the API task live. Also, we covered after invoking in the form how you can call it in the process. We have listed all these things. And Vineet was covering like about the API task deployment. Here it shows what is the difference between all these three. So in detail, this is the introduction part. And once you finish the introduction, you can go to the detailed parts, like where we talk about the invoking of the API task in form, like task by task. We divided each thing and we showed clearly. And we also have a example here. It is the same example, the zip code example, what Aaron showed. We have a step-by-step procedure how to build this example, and what type of response we get. We have everything here. So you can actually go over this topic, try yourself one by one, and you can build the example yourself. So that is this part, and this is a process part. And also we have a special API task runner here who gets added to the control room when you have API task in it. So this topic explains what is an API task runner is and what happens to the control room. Like automatically this user gets added to the control room when you have appropriate licenses. And this topic here, the packages supported, this is what Aaron was showing, all the packages. So this lists all the packages with the version number. So you can actually look at this to see what are all the packages supported in API task. And this is what actually Vineet was showing about the API task, where you can call the API task as a endpoint. So in 31, we introduced the on-demand endpoint, where via a form process, you invoke an API task. Starting 32, you can actually call the API task real time without invoking it via a form or a process. So this topic clearly defines, like clearly explains you how you can do it. It also has an example in it. So you guys are more than welcome to see this. And out of all the FAQs, like the frequently asked questions, we have listed, I've put a topic on this, like how everything happens in the API task. You can go over and look at this as well. So this is the documentation we have on API task. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Nirmal. There's one more question, Nirmal. Do we have the architecture anywhere on the docs portal by any chance? Because some of the folks were interested to know more about the architecture.
Right now, we don't have an architectural diagram, but I think it's a good idea to add this. I will, after this meeting, I'll talk with Vineet. Probably we will come up with an architectural diagram and have it in the docs.
Sure. Thank you, Nirmal.
Thanks, Arjun.
Okay, great. So let me just take you to some of the courses we have also published on the Automation Anywhere University. Let me quickly share my screen.
And we see it.
Okay, great. So we have published these courses recently, like the top 5 features in the .32 release, and a couple of more interesting courses as listed here. We also have a course on how do you use Google Gemini and also the OpenAI Assistant. So please try them out. And we are also going to soon launch the the entire Delta training for the .32 release, so that you will get to understand what are the top 5 features and deep dive into all of those features and a lot more covered in this release as well. Okay. And other than this, some of you are asking, like, what is the next topic? So here is the next topic. We're going to talk about how to utilize the code analysis and the debugging tools. So that's our next meetup, which is coming up on May 30th. I'll also share this registration link with all of you in the chat box. We will also email you with this link, so that please do register. We hope to see you in the next session. Also, I have a specific ask for you. Like, we would like to hear the feedback about how this session was. We don't want to just collect it in an internal form. Instead, what I would like to do is we know that we have published this on the LinkedIn. So what I'll do is I'll just paste this link where the Automation Anywhere we had just shared out this about the session. So if you could just write a line about how you felt about this session, that'll mean that it'll reach a lot more developers, and we expect a lot more developers to join this session next time as well. Okay, so those are all the ones I wanted to cover. Thanks a lot, Aaron, for putting across all these demos. And thank you, Vineet, for sharing the architecture, the licensing, and also from the product perspective. And thank you, Nirmal, for showing the docs portal, how to get that content and whatever you have put it across for API tasks. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. I hope you had an insightful session on API tasks. And please do share your feedback on LinkedIn. I've just posted that in the chat window as well. And thanks a lot, everyone, for joining. See you in the next month meetup. Have a
Thanks,
good day
everyone.
and have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.